London, November 1814. The report arrived on Edmund Ralston's desk on a Tuesday, and he did not read it until Thursday, because on Tuesday he had been at his club, and on Wednesday at Parliament, and by Thursday the steward's covering letter had worked its way to the top of the pile through the patient gravity of neglect. He read it standing up. He read it again sitting down. 41 pages, in his steward Robert Marsh's cramped handwriting. But the mind behind the words belonged to no one Edmund had encountered in 12 years of managing a duchy that stretched across 3 northern counties and refused consistently to behave. The report opened without ceremony. The Ralston Northern tenancies have been mismanaged, not through negligence, but through a misreading of local soil conditions dating to the estate survey of 1798. The survey was wrong. Everything built upon it has been wrong in the same direction. It then proceeded for 41 pages to prove this with a calm, structural precision that made Edmund feel, for the first time in recent memory, that he was the least intelligent person in the room. He set it face up on his desk when he finished. He did not close it. He went to the window and thought about the survey of 1798, which he had inherited along with everything else, and which he had never once questioned. He wrote to Marsh that afternoon. Who prepared this? Marsh's reply came the following morning. A consultant I engaged on your behalf, Your Grace. They prefer to remain anonymous for the present. I can assure you the analysis is sound. Edmund wrote back, It is more than sound. Engage them for a second report. The southern drainage will be next. He set Marsh's letter aside and picked up the report again, opened to page 7, and ran his finger slowly along the margin where the argument turned, the precise point where the anonymous consultant had identified the flaw in the 1798 survey and begun methodically to dismantle everything downstream of it. The margin was clean, no annotations, no hedging. The author had been certain before they began to write. Edmund found this either admirable or irritating. He had not yet decided which. The dinner at Marsh's house in Bloomsbury was not the sort of event Edmund would ordinarily attend. He had accepted the invitation because Marsh had mentioned, with careful indirection, that the anonymous consultant might be present. Edmund wanted to meet them. He arrived at 7. There were 14 guests. He moved through introductions with the efficiency of a man who had been introduced to strangers since the age of 9 and had long since stopped expecting to be surprised. Marsh introduced his niece near the fireplace, almost as an afterthought. My niece, Miss Eleanor Marsh. She keeps house for me while that is, she has been residing with me this past year. She is very fond of reading. Miss Eleanor Marsh was 27. Not handsome in the way that demanded attention, but the kind of woman whose face, once noticed, was difficult to dismiss. Precise features, dark eyes that moved across a room the way a surveyor's did, cataloguing. She wore a grey dress that had been well made and was no longer new. She curtsied with the economy of someone who found the gesture faintly absurd, but performed it anyway. Miss Marsh, Edmund said. Your Grace. Her voice was level, not deferential, simply calibrated as though she had already decided exactly how much of herself this introduction warranted. He moved on. He spent 20 minutes with a land agent named Perkins, another 15 with a solicitor named Graves. He kept watch between sentences for whoever among the 14 guests might be the anonymous consultant. No one presented themselves. No one said anything that approached the quality of the report. He was standing near the window with a glass of indifferent claret, when Sir William Choate, a baronet he knew from Parliament, turned to the room and said, I have been reading that piece arguing for women's inclusion on land committees. What does everyone think? The room offered the usual range. Edmund said, Sentiment is not a substitute for rigour. The argument for inclusion tends to rest on general principle rather than demonstrated capacity. I have no objection to the principle. I have never encountered the capacity. He said it without heat. It was simply his assessment of the evidence. There was agreement from Choate and Perkins. Edmund became aware gradually that Miss Eleanor Marsh had gone very still. She was standing 6 feet to his left. She had a glass of wine in her hand. She did not speak. She looked at Edmund for exactly 2 seconds, not with outrage, not with hurt, but with the flat attention of someone filing a piece of information carefully away. And then she turned and said something quiet to the woman beside her about the soup. Edmund looked at her a moment longer. Then he returned to Choate. Dinner was at 8. Edmund was placed diagonally across from Miss Marsh. She sat between the younger solicitor, who was trying to be interesting, and an older woman who was not. Have you been in town long, Miss Marsh? Edmund asked in the interval between courses. "A year, Your Grace." "And before that?" "Shropshire. You prefer London. I prefer useful occupation. London happens to be where my uncle lives." The solicitor laughed as though she had made a joke. She had not. "And what occupation do you find?" Edmund asked. "Reading, as my uncle mentioned, and assisting him where I can." "Assisting with what?" Something crossed her face. Amusement, briefly. "Correspondence, organization, the kind of work that keeps a household in order." "Valuable work," Edmund said in the tone one uses when one means it politely, but not particularly. "Yes," said Miss Marsh, "it is." She turned back to her plate. Edmund found, across the remainder of dinner, that his attention returned to her with an irregularity that annoyed him, not because she was remarkable, because she was consistently present in a way most people at dinner parties were not. When Chota made a point about the northern harvests, she set down her fork. When Marsh mentioned the Ralston estate by name, her posture shifted, barely, but he caught it. After dinner, the men gathered in Marsh's small study for port. Edmund waited for one of them to reveal themselves as the consultant. None did. He left at 10. In the carriage, he thought about the report, the clean margins, and the mind that had been certain before it began to write. He did not think about Miss Marsh. Or rather, he told himself he did not, which was a different thing. The second time Eleanor saw the Duke of Ralston, he was in her uncle's hallway, and she was coming down the stairs with an ink stain on her left hand she had not yet addressed. She stopped on the 4th step. He looked up. He had arrived early, which was the kind of liberty a duke took with complete unconscious confidence that the world would rearrange itself accordingly. "Miss Marsh." "Your Grace." She came down the remaining steps at an even pace. "My uncle is expected within the half-hour. You are welcome to wait in the sitting room." His eyes moved to her left hand. She did not conceal it. "Ink," she said. "Yes." "I was writing letters." "Of course." She could not tell whether he believed her. She showed him to the sitting room, went to find Parker about tea, and stood in the hallway longer than necessary, her ink-stained hand against the wall. She had known Edmund Ralston would be her uncle's most important client before she had ever seen his face. She had read enough estate correspondence to understand the scale of what he managed and the degree to which it was not being managed well. 3 months ago, she had offered to look at the northern tenancy figures, not because she expected to be listened to, but because the figures were wrong, and she found wrongness in figures personally offensive. Her uncle had listened, as he always did, with a mixture of genuine respect and genuine anxiety. He had presented her analysis as his own work, with her knowledge and approval, because that was the only way it would be used. They had discussed this without sentiment or illusion. Eleanor understood the world she was operating in. She had understood it since she was 19, and had watched her father's solicitor explain very kindly that her opinions on the estate accounts were charming but irrelevant. What she had not anticipated was that Edmund Ralston would turn out to have a mind that worked. She had noticed it at dinner. Not the remark about sentiment and rigour, which had been ignorant but not stupid. Ignorant was correctable. She had noticed the way he listened to Perkins about Lincolnshire drainage with the focused attention of a man actually trying to learn, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She did not want to notice these things. They made the arrangement more complicated. She went back with tea, poured it with efficiency, and sat across from him. "My uncle speaks well of you," he said. "He is generous. He says you have been invaluable since your arrival." "He has been invaluable to me," Eleanor said. "It is a mutual arrangement." "You ran your father's household in Shropshire?" "After his death, yes, for 2 years." "And before that?" "His correspondence, his accounts, his library, which required a great deal of management. He had more books than method." She paused. "He also had more opinions than income, which requires careful management of an entirely different sort." Edmund's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the preliminary architecture of one. "I recognize that condition in several of my parliamentary colleagues. I imagine it is common in men who are never required to balance accounts themselves." "That is a direct observation." "Oh, you asked a direct question." He looked at her for a moment. "So I did." Her uncle arrived 20 minutes later, and the conversation shifted to estate business. Eleanor excused herself and went upstairs. She sat at her desk and looked at the draft of the Southern Drainage Report, 30 pages, half finished, and picked up her pen. She wrote for 2 hours. The ink stain on her left hand was joined by another on her right. The Southern Drainage Report was delivered to Edmund the following week, again in Marsh's handwriting, again without attribution. Edmund read it in one sitting. It was sharper than the first, more willing to state plainly what the numbers meant, as though the author had grown between reports more confident in the right to an opinion. He wrote to Marsh, "Please convey my compliments and ask whether they would consider a third commission, the home farm accounts for the past 5 years. I will pay accordingly. I should also very much like to know who I am dealing with. I find I am simply curious." Marsh's reply came in 2 days. "The consultant accepts the commission and is grateful for your confidence. As to their identity, they have asked me to convey that they prefer, for professional reasons, to maintain the current arrangement. I hope this is not an inconvenience." Edmund read this and found to his mild surprise that it was an inconvenience. He had read 300 pages of this person's thinking. He knew the way their mind moved across a problem. He had the specific and persistent sense that he was being addressed by someone he ought to be able to place, and could not. He picked up the Southern Drainage Report and opened it to page 12. His finger traced the margin where the argument turned. The consultant preferred anonymity for professional reasons. Professional reasons. Edmund considered this. People maintained anonymity for 3 kinds of reasons: embarrassment, fear, or protection. The prose suggested none of the first. The precision suggested none of the second. He turned the page and kept reading, and did not yet arrive at the correct conclusion. The invitation to Hathersley Park came from Lady Stanhope, Edmund's second cousin, who made it her annual business to assemble for a fortnight in December a collection of people who would interest each other, whether they wished to be interested or not. He arrived to find Robert Marsh's name on the guest list, and below it, Miss Eleanor Marsh. He stood in the entrance hall with his coat still on, and read her name and felt something he chose to call mild surprise. Lady Stanhope appeared at his elbow. She was 60, sharp-featured, and entirely unrepentant. "You've seen the list." "I have." "Marsh has been managing the Hathersley timber accounts for 3 years, and his niece is—" A pause, which for Lady Stanhope was unusual. "Interesting. You'll see." "I have met Miss Marsh," Edmund said. "Have you?" She studied him with the unsentimental attention of a woman who had assembled many house parties and made a study of the results. "Then you know." "I know she is fond of reading," Edmund said. Lady Stanhope smiled very slightly. "Yes, that is one way to put it." She moved away before he could ask what another way might be. Hathersley was large enough that 14 guests could spend a morning without encountering each other, if they chose their routes carefully. Eleanor had chosen her routes carefully for 2 days. On the 3rd, she came down to the library at 7 in the morning specifically because it would be empty, and found Edmund Ralston already there, in his riding clothes, with a book open in his hands. He looked up. "I did not know you were an early riser," she said. "I rode at 6. The library seemed preferable to breakfast." He glanced at his book, then at her. "I hope I am not in the way." "It is not my library," Eleanor said, and came in. She went to the east shelves where Lady Stanhope kept the agricultural texts. She needed Sinclair's treatise on drainage gradients for the 3rd Ralston Commission, which was due in 3 weeks. She scanned the shelves with an air of browsing, found it 4 shelves down wedged between 2 volumes of Cobbett, and pulled it out. "Sinclair's drainage study," Edmund said from across the room. He had crossed toward her without her noticing. "Yes." "An unusual choice for early morning. I find technical texts easier to read before the social requirements of the day take hold." He looked at the book, then at her. "Do you read much agricultural theory?" "A fair amount. I grew up near working farmland. The theory is illuminating when set beside practical reality." "And does it hold up?" "Sometimes. Sinclair is better than most. He actually visited the fields he was writing about, which puts him ahead of roughly half his contemporaries." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "The consultant I have been working with made a similar point in a recent report, the primacy of direct observation over inherited assumption." Eleanor kept her face still. "Did they?" "It is a consistent thread in their work." He looked at the Sinclair in her hands. "Perhaps they have read Sinclair." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, opened the book to a page in the middle and read it with perfect concentration until he moved away. By the 4th day, the library had acquired a pattern. Edmund came after his ride. Eleanor came at 7. They sat in the same room with whatever they were reading, and some mornings the silence held for an hour, and other mornings he asked her something. His questions were not conversational filler. They were real questions, from a mind working a problem, and real questions demanded real answers. She had spent enough of her life giving abbreviated answers to men who would not have understood the full ones, that the alternative was genuinely difficult to resist. "You are arguing the graduated yield model was flawed from inception," Edmund said one morning, over a parliamentary taxation report. "The committee that designed it included Wilberforce. Are you saying Wilberforce was wrong?" "I am saying Wilberforce was a moral genius and a patchy economist. The model assumes uniform soil productivity across landholding size, which is untrue in the northern counties. It is a London assumption about land that Londoners have not recently visited." Edmund looked at her. The consultant made a version of that argument about the Ralston survey. "Did they?" She counted the times she had said "did they" in the same careful tone, and whether he had noticed. She thought he had not. She was becoming less certain. On the 8th morning, he brought the 3rd Ralston Commission to the library. He spread it on the table by the window and sat with it for 40 minutes before she arrived. "Come in, Miss Marsh. I'm wrestling with the home farm accounts and would welcome a second opinion." She sat across from him. She looked at the pages spread across the table, her own work, 43 pages, and kept her face level. "What is the difficulty?" she asked. "Page 22. He turned to it and slid it across. "The consultant concludes the estate manager was either incompetent or corrupt. I find the conclusion a little stark." Eleanor read page 22, which she had written at 11 on a Tuesday in October by candlelight, and which had seemed to her then, as now, entirely unavoidable. "What simpler explanation do you see?" she asked. "Administrative error, consistent but not necessarily deliberate. The inconsistency runs across 7 consecutive records," Eleanor said, "in exactly the same direction. Consistent error that always benefits the same party is indistinguishable from intent." He looked at her. "You sound very certain." "The figures are certain. I am only reporting what they say." A pause. "You reason like the consultant." "I grew up reading accounts," she said. "My father's. It is a habit of mind. A useful one." He drew the page back and looked at it, his finger tracing the column of figures she had annotated. "You are right, of course. I was giving the man a benefit of a doubt he had not earned." He turned to page 23. "What do you make of the Millgate transactions?" She told him. He listened with the full attention she had been cataloguing for weeks, leaning slightly forward, no part of his mind reserved for his own response. She had thought, in the first days at Hathersley, that this quality might diminish at close range. It had not. "The Millgate records suggest the same manager," she said. "Different field, same pattern." Then it was deliberate. "Yes." He sat back and looked at the ceiling with the quiet anger of a man working out the full extent of having been deceived. "How long has this been happening?" "The consultant will have detailed it." She stopped herself. "I believe the full timeline is in the latter pages." He found the page. He read it. She watched him absorb information she had assembled, and his face do the things it did when thinking, a stillness, then a slight movement at the jaw, then the recalibration of a mind determined to act. "This is extraordinary work," he said. To the page, not to her. "Whoever prepared this, the rigor of it. I keep saying I want to meet this person, and I keep meaning it. I cannot fathom why they persist in remaining anonymous." Eleanor looked at the white Derbyshire hills through the window. "Perhaps they find the arrangement has advantages," she said. "What advantages could possibly—" He stopped. He looked at her. She met his eyes with the composed attention she had been practicing for some time. "What advantages, Miss Marsh?" She held his gaze 2 seconds too long and then said, "I could not say, Your Grace," and picked up the Sinclair and read it with perfect concentration until he closed the report and went to breakfast. He left it on the table, face up, open to the page about the Millgate records. It was a habit she had noticed across every visit. He always left documents open, face up, as though closing them would interrupt the thinking. She sat alone in the library for a long time after he left. She did not read another word. On the 6th evening, Lord Henry Pembridge arrived. He was 34, a friend of Lady Stanhope's son, and he had once walked into her uncle's study at a moment when Eleanor had been working on the first Ralston report with the draft pages spread across the desk. He had seen her handwriting at the top before she turned the stack over. He had said nothing. He had looked at her with thoughtful assessment, said he was looking for Marsh, and left. He had never mentioned it. She had never forgotten it. He greeted her on the evening of his arrival with a warmth slightly in excess of their acquaintance. "Miss Marsh, I had not expected to find you here." "Nor I you." "Lady Stanhope collects interesting people. He took the chair beside her. I understand you have been here a week. Is it as stimulating as promised? The library is excellent. I imagine it is. He held her gaze for a moment, and there it was, the quiet knowledge in it, the awareness they were both, for now, declining to name. I look forward to discussing it with you. He moved on to talk to Lady Stanhope's son. Eleanor set down her embroidery and picked up her wine. Across the room, Edmund was talking about the northern harvests. His back was to her. She watched him set down his wineglass and turn to answer a question, and felt, with the precision she brought to everything, exactly how complicated the situation had become. Edmund returned to London from Hathersley with the Home Farm report under his arm, and a question that had taken on the quality of an obstruction, not urgent, not disabling, but present, like a stone in a boot. Who was the consultant? He had spent 2 weeks in a house with 14 people. The consultant was not among them, or rather no one had shown themselves to be, which was different. He had read the 3 reports a combined 40 or 50 times by now, in sections, returning to the passages that interested him most. The 1798 survey argument, the drainage gradient on page 12, page 22, the grain records, now sent to a solicitor for investigation. The lateral connection on page 38 between the Millgate irregularities and a secondary record he had not known to look for until the consultant pointed him there. He tried to build a picture of the mind. Cambridge educated, he had concluded. Rigorous, theoretically fluent but not academic. Too interested in practical consequence. A man with estate background and leisure to read seriously. Possibly a younger son with an independent income. He wrote to Marsh, I am more than ever convinced I must meet the consultant. The quality of this work merits a direct professional relationship, properly constituted. Please convey this again, and with emphasis. He sent the letter and went to his club and talked about the Corn Laws, and came home and sat in his study, and looked at the open report and tried again to place the mind behind it. He failed again. He went to bed. The January morning call was Eleanor's acknowledgement that avoiding Edmund Ralston in London required more active management than avoiding him in Derbyshire, and that active avoidance was conspicuous. She arrived at her uncle's sitting room at 10:30 to find Edmund already there, arrived early again. I understand you have engaged a solicitor for the Millgate matter, she said, sitting. Your uncle mentioned it. I hope it proceeds satisfactorily. It is early days. The consultant's evidence is strong. He paused. I wrote to Marsh again last week about meeting them. I know. He looked at her. Marsh told you. My uncle shares most of his correspondence with me. He mentioned your emphasis. She held his gaze steadily. And what do you think? He asked. Of the insistence on anonymity? Eleanor set down her tea. I think people who do good work in difficult circumstances often have reasons for the conditions they set, and I think a man who genuinely values the work ought to be able to value it regardless of whether he can put a name and face to it. That is a reasonable position. I thought so. It is also slightly a rebuke. She allowed a small smile, only slightly. He looked at the window, then back at her. Most people are not forthright with me. I find I have become accustomed to it in you. She heard this. She set it in the part of her mind reserved for things she could not yet examine and said, Was there a 4th commission? My uncle mentioned something of the kind. The water rights along the northern border. A dispute with the neighbouring estate running since my father's time. I believe it has a practical rather than a legal resolution, but I need someone to look at the records fresh. Water rights are complex. The historical documentation tends to be partial. The consultant seemed untroubled by partial documentation in the previous reports. Partial documentation is only a problem if one is looking for certainty, Eleanor said. If one is looking for the most probable interpretation of available evidence, it is a constraint to work within, not an obstacle. Edmund was looking at her with the particular focused quality she had learned to be cautious of. That is exactly the kind of distinction the consultant makes, he said. In the 3rd report, the footnote on page 36. Eleanor picked up her tea. I read a great deal, as my uncle mentioned. Miss Marsh, his voice was measured. I find speaking with you that I am consistently, he paused. The quality of your thinking is not what I expected. She looked at him and waited. That is not meant as condescension, he said. I know, which is why I have not taken it as one. She held his gaze. What did you expect when you met me? A pause. He was deciding to be honest rather than kind. A woman who read novels, he said, and was pleasant company. And instead? Instead, I have had my own consultant's reports explained to me by a woman who reads Sinclair at 7 in the morning. The ghost of a smile, hers and his simultaneously, and then withdrawn by the same instinct. How unfortunate for you, she said. Unexpectedly the opposite, he said, and looked away. Parker arrived with fresh tea. Edmund stayed 20 minutes longer than custom required, and left without explaining why. Eleanor sat for a long time after he had gone, and did not examine the 20 minutes with any rigor at all. The fourth report took 6 weeks. The water rights documentation was fragmentary, one chain of transfer from 1762 entirely absent, requiring reconstruction from adjacent records. Eleanor worked at her uncle's desk until midnight more evenings than was advisable, and told herself the work was interesting, because it was interesting, which was true and also insufficient. She finished on the 17th of February and gave it to her uncle, and spent the next 2 days reorganizing the household accounts, which required no interpretation and did not interest her at all. Edmund received the fourth report on a Monday and read it in one sitting. He sent for Marsh on the Thursday. Marsh came to Grosvenor Square at 11, slightly breathless, hat in hand. Edmund offered coffee and did not immediately come to the point. The water rights report is the best work the consultant has produced, Edmund said. The reconstruction of the 1762 transfer is original analysis, the kind one would expect from the published theorists, not a private commission. Marsh nodded carefully. The Millgate investigation has confirmed everything identified in the third report. The solicitor expects to recover a significant portion of the losses. The estate is in a materially different position than it was in October. Edmund looked at him. I want to engage this person directly and permanently. A proper retainer, formal terms, work attributed by name. What I am currently doing, commissioning through an intermediary from a person I have never met, serves no one well. Marsh was quiet. I would like to understand the preference for anonymity, Edmund said. Not to override it, to understand it. Marsh turned his hat once in his hands. May I ask a question, Your Grace? Please. If you were to discover the consultant's identity, would your assessment of the work change? Edmund looked at him. No, why would it? The quality of the analysis, the professional relationship you are proposing, would any of that be affected by the nature of who the consultant is? I have just said it would not. Marsh looked at him for a long moment, with the measuring attention of a man who was not unintelligent, only quiet about it. I will speak to the consultant. I cannot promise more than that. He left. Edmund stood in his study looking at the fourth report, open on his desk to the reconstruction of the 1762 transfer. The handwriting was Marsh's. The thinking was not. He tried again to place the mind. Cambridge educated, a man of uncommon. He stopped. He thought about Eleanor Marsh in the library at 7 in the morning with the Sinclair. He thought about her saying, consistent error that always benefits the same party is indistinguishable from intent, with the precision of someone reporting facts rather than forming opinions. He thought about the ink stain on her left hand. I was writing letters. He thought about every morning in the library, every question she had answered with the specificity of someone who had the primary texts open in front of them. He thought about, I believe, followed by a pause and a careful redirection. He thought about, did they, said 3 times in the same flat tone. He thought about Pembridge sitting beside her on the 6th evening at Hathersley, with the warmth of a man who knew the actual version of the person he was looking at. He thought about Marsh saying, the reasons are not unreasonable given the nature of the consultant's situation. He sat down. He thought it cannot be. He thought, she keeps his house, she is fond of reading. He picked up the fourth report and read it again from the beginning, and this time he did not look for the Cambridge man. He looked at what was actually on the page, the controlled precision of every conclusion, the refusal to hedge, the single point of origin, and the indistinguishable from intent, and the implacable confidence of a mind that knew it was right and had learned somewhere that knowing alone was not enough. He set the report down. He had stood in a drawing room in Bloomsbury in November and said in front of a room that included Eleanor Marsh that sentiment was not a substitute for rigor, and that he had never encountered the capacity he was looking for. She had been 6 feet to his left. He had read her work 50 times since then. He had called it extraordinary. He had said the mind behind it could not be placed among anyone he knew, while the mind behind it sat across from him in a library every morning and explained his own reports to him and said, "Did they's" in a flat tone, and picked up the Sinclair. Edmund reached out and closed the fourth report for the first time and set it face down on the desk. The gathering at Lord Fenwick's townhouse on the third evening of March was the kind of event Edmund attended, because the alternative was to send his apologies and spend the evening in his study with the closed report, which he had now moved twice without opening. He had not called on Marsh since Thursday. He had not written. He had spent 5 days in the specific discomfort of a man who has formed a conclusion he cannot yet prove and is not entirely certain he wants to. The rooms were full by 9. Edmund talked to 3 people he respected, and 4 he did not, and accepted a glass of wine he did not particularly want, and was standing near the side table when Pembridge arrived. They had spoken at Hathersley, briefly, without consequence, the kind of exchange that exists only to establish that 2 men occupy the same room without friction. Pembridge was agreeable. Edmund had found nothing to object to in him, and had not tried particularly hard to find something, which was its own kind of information. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes later with her uncle. She wore dark blue, her hair simply dressed, and she crossed the room to speak to Lady Stanhope with the self-possessed economy that Edmund had catalogued across months, and which he now watched with a different quality of attention than he had before. She had not yet seen him. He knew this because she had not yet recalibrated, and she always recalibrated when she saw him, a barely perceptible settling, the composure locating itself 1 fraction more precisely, like a surveyor's instrument leveling before a reading. He watched her laugh at something Lady Stanhope said, genuine amusement, not performed, her head tilting slightly, the laugh brief and unguarded before it closed again. He looked away. The fourth report was on his desk, face down, where he had left it 6 days ago. He had not told himself why he hadn't opened it. Pembridge found him at the side table near 10 o'clock. They talked about Parliament for several minutes, the Northern Land Tax, which was again under revision, and which Pembridge had opinions on that were not unintelligent. Edmund listened with half his attention and kept the other half on the room, which was a habit of long standing, and this evening had a specific object. Eleanor was talking to a woman Edmund didn't know, then to Graves, the solicitor from Marsh's November dinner. Then she moved toward the side table where the refreshments were laid, and Pembridge, without interrupting himself mid-sentence, reached out and picked up the report that Edmund had set on the table's edge, the fourth commission, which Edmund had brought because he had intended to discuss a specific point with another guest, and had not yet done so. Pembridge glanced at it. Edmund watched his face. It was brief. Pembridge looked at the cover, and then he looked across the room at Eleanor, who had stopped 3 feet from the table and was looking at him with an expression that was almost nothing, and was, in its very precise almost nothingness, everything. "You ought to ask Miss Marsh directly about the Ralston water rights, Your Grace," Pembridge said. He said it easily, pleasantly, with the distracted tone of a man making a reasonable social suggestion. "She knows the Northern Border documentation rather better than most." The room did not go entirely still. 3 conversations continued. Lady Stanhope was laughing somewhere to the left. The world maintained its ordinary motion. Edmund looked at Pembridge, then at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Pembridge with an expression he had not seen on her before, not anger, not panic. Something that arrived and was immediately suppressed, and the suppression was the most visible thing about it. Edmund picked up the report from the table. He held it. He looked at the cover, which said nothing. Marsh had never titled them, only numbered them in his own covering letters. He opened it to the first page. He had read this page 11 times. The water rights dispute along the Ralston northern border originates in a single misapplied precedent from 1762, the consequences of which have compounded across 50 years of subsequent transfer. He had read it 11 times, and he read it a 12th time, and he thought about sitting across from Eleanor Marsh in her uncle's sitting room in January, and her saying, "Partial documentation is only a problem if one is looking for certainty," and the precision of it, the specific quality of a distinction that had appeared word for word in the footnote on page 8. He looked up. Eleanor was watching him. She had not moved. Her hands were still at her sides, not clasped, not braced, simply still, with the perfect economy of a woman who has decided that stillness is the only thing left available to her and is executing it completely. Edmund looked at the report. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. "The consultant," he said. His voice was even. The analysis of the 1762 transfer. Yes, Eleanor said. One word. Flat, clear, neither defiant nor apologetic. Yes. She did not elaborate. She did not explain. She held his gaze with the level attention she had brought to every conversation they had ever had, which he now understood entirely differently, and waited. Edmund looked at the first page of the report again. He was aware that Pembridge had taken a careful step sideways and was examining the refreshments with great interest. He was aware that the three conversations around them had continued. He was aware that his own mind was doing something uncomfortable, not revising so much as collapsing. The entire structure of the past 4 months reorganizing around a single fixed point that had been there all along. He said, the northern tenancies. Yes. The drainage survey. Yes. The home farm accounts. He stopped. All of it. All of it, Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, and he heard it as he said it, heard the specific quality of the error, but the rigor of it, the theoretical framework, He stopped himself. Eleanor's chin lifted by a fraction, not defiance, precision. She waited. He stopped himself again. He had been about to say, it reads like a man's work. He had stopped because he had heard what he was about to say, and because Eleanor Marsh was standing 3 feet from him, waiting for him to say it, with an expression that told him she had been waiting for it. Specifically, across 4 months of libraries and morning calls and reports, he had called extraordinary, without once looking at who was in the room. He did not say it. Eleanor looked at him for 2 more seconds. Then she said, I hope the water rights matter resolves satisfactorily, Your Grace, and turned and walked toward the far end of the room, where Lady Stanhope was still laughing, and she inserted herself into the conversation with complete composure and did not look back. No one around Edmund spoke. Pembridge was still examining the refreshments. Edmund stood with the report in his hands. Open to the first page, he read the first line a 13th time. Then he closed it. He set it on the table, face down, the way he had left it on his desk for 6 days. He picked up his wine and finished it. He thought about nothing in particular, and several things at once, and said nothing to Pembridge, and nothing to anyone else, and left at 10:30, and sat in his carriage in the dark and looked at the closed report in his hands. He had said sentiment was not a substitute for rigor. He had said he had never encountered the capacity. She had been in the room. He called at Marsh's house the following morning at 10 o'clock, which was within the acceptable hours for a morning call, and which he had spent precisely no time considering from the perspective of acceptability. Parker opened the door. Edmund gave his card. Parker returned after 2 minutes and showed him to the sitting room, which meant Eleanor had decided to receive him, which told him something. She was standing when he came in. Not arranged, simply standing near the window, as though she had been there before he arrived and saw no reason to adjust. She was wearing the same practical dark blue she wore for work, not a receiving dress. Her ink-stained hand was at her side, unconcerned. Your Grace, she said. Miss Marsh. He came in, he did not sit. They stood on opposite sides of the room with the distance of a conversation that had not yet decided what it was. I owe you an apology. You owe me several, Eleanor said, but I suspect you have only prepared one. Edmund looked at her. You heard what I was about to say last night. I heard what you stopped yourself from saying, which was, I thought, more informative than if you had said it. He was quiet for a moment. I was about to say it reads like a man's work. Yes. That was, he stopped. Wrong, she offered. Incorrect in its assumptions about the necessary origin of rigorous thinking, or simply a statement about what you expected to find, which is a different kind of problem? Both, Edmund said, all of it. Eleanor said nothing. I want to be clear about what I am apologizing for, he said, because he was a man who led with precision even when precision was uncomfortable. Not only last night, November. I said, in a room that included you, that I had never encountered the capacity I was looking for. I had in fact already read 41 pages of it. I simply had not. I had not considered. You had not considered that the capacity might belong to the woman in the grey dress who kept her uncle's house, Eleanor said. No, I had not. She looked at him with the flat clarity that he now understood was not composure so much as control, the specific control of a person who had learned to hold things still that wanted to move. You called it extraordinary, she said. 4 separate times across 4 reports. You told my uncle it was the clearest economic thinking you had encountered outside the published theorists. You sat in a library in Derbyshire and told me directly that you could not make the mind behind it fit anyone you knew. She paused. I was sitting across the table from you. I know. You read my own conclusions to me and asked what I made of them. I know. You told me the prose alone suggested a Cambridge education. Her voice remained level throughout. It was more devastating for being level. I am self-taught. I taught myself in my father's library in Shropshire, which had more books than method, as I believe I mentioned. Edmund said nothing for a moment then. Why did you not tell me? He asked it without accusation. He wanted the actual answer. Eleanor was quiet. She turned to the window and then back, and he saw her decide something, to give him the honest version, not the strategic one. Because of what you said in November, she said, before I had shown you a single figure, before you had spoken 20 words to me. You informed a room that sentiment was not a substitute for rigor, and that you had never encountered the capacity in a woman, and you said it with the perfect certainty of a man who had never had reason to revise the opinion. She stopped. What exactly should I have said to you? I have done this work. I prepared this analysis. The 41 pages in my uncle's handwriting, those are mine. Would you have read them? Would you have sent them to a solicitor and recovered your losses? Or would you have smiled and said how charming and gone home? Edmund did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. I used the anonymity because I had no alternative that would have produced the same result, Eleanor said. Not because I was ashamed of the work. I am not ashamed of the work. The work is extraordinary, Edmund said. I meant that every time I said it. I know you did. She said it without warmth and without bitterness, simply as a fact. That is the part that is most... She stopped. Most what? She looked at him. Most instructive, she said carefully, about the nature of the problem. Edmund took this in. The problem being that I valued the work completely, while being incapable of imagining who had done it. Yes. Because I had already decided. Yes. He sat down. Not because he needed to, but because the conversation had the weight of something that required acknowledgement. Eleanor remained standing. I asked Marsh repeatedly to identify you, he said. I said I wanted a proper professional arrangement. I said I wanted the work attributed by name. My uncle told me. Did you believe me? She looked at him steadily. I believed you wanted to find the consultant, she said. I believed you would have been pleased if it were a man of the right kind, the kind you had already built in your mind. A pause. I was not certain what you would do when the consultant turned out to be something else. Something else, Edmund repeated. A woman. Specifically your steward's niece who keeps his house and is fond of reading. The phrase landed, and he heard it. His own description of her from the November dinner returned now with its full cost attached. He had introduced her to himself as a woman who kept house and read novels, and he had believed it, and he had sat across from her in library after library and morning call after morning call, and had been revised entirely without ever revising the label. I was wrong, he said. Yes, Eleanor said, you were. I am saying so directly. I heard you. That is not enough, he said. I know that. I am not offering it as sufficient. She looked at him for a long moment. The window behind her was grey, February still clinging to March, the street outside ordinary and indifferent. What are you offering? She asked. He said, I would like to engage you directly. Your name, a formal retainer, terms of your choosing. No intermediary. The work attributed to you as the work is done, whatever that costs in the way of talk, which I imagine will be considerable and which I am prepared for. Eleanor said nothing. I understand if the answer is no, Edmund said. I understand if the answer is that you would prefer to continue the current arrangement or to discontinue the work entirely. Those are reasonable responses to the situation, as it has been. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was going to say one of those things. Then she said, why? He looked at her. Why does it matter to you, she said, that my name is on it? You have the reports, you have the analysis, the estate has benefited materially, the arrangement has been productive. Why does it matter? Edmund said, because the work is yours. Because I have been benefiting from something without acknowledging its source, because... He stopped. He started again, more carefully. Because I sat in a room in November and said something that was incorrect, and I said it in front of you, and you have been working for me for 4 months since then, and every time I called the work extraordinary, I was saying it without knowing I was saying it to you, and that is not... He stopped again. Not what? Eleanor said. He looked at her directly. Not something I am willing to continue. Eleanor held his gaze. The silence was long. Outside, the grey street was acquiring a thin March light. She said, I would require full attribution. My name on every commission, past and future. Yes. And I would require that the terms be set by me, not offered by you. Yes. And I would require... She stopped. She turned to the window. When she turned back, her face had changed. Not open, exactly, but fractionally less controlled. I would require that the next time you have a settled opinion about someone you have not yet spoken to, you consider the possibility that the survey of 1798 was wrong. Edmund was quiet. Then, that is a reasonable requirement. So I thought so, Eleanor said. The ghost of a smile. Hers first this time. He was not quick enough to withdraw his. She sat down at last in the chair across from him, and Parker arrived with tea that neither of them had asked for, and both of them accepted. And they talked for an hour about the northern border dispute and the terms of a proper retainer and a formal arrangement, and all of it was practical, and none of it was only practical, and when Edmund left at noon, he did not explain why he had stayed as long as he had. He walked to Grosvenor Square instead of taking the carriage. It was cold, and the sky was the particular white of late winter about to become something else. He walked the whole way and thought about nothing he would have been able to name, which was its own kind of answer. 6 weeks later, a notice appeared in the professional correspondence of the 3 largest land management publications in England. It was brief. It announced that Miss Eleanor Marsh, formerly consultant to the Ralston estate under an anonymous arrangement, had been engaged as principal estate analyst to the Duke of Ralston on a formal retainer. It listed her previous commissions by title. It was signed by Edmund Ralston, Duke of Ralston, in his own name. The notice caused talk. Edmund had expected this and had composed it anyway, which Eleanor had observed without comment, and which had told her something she was not yet ready to name. Lady Stanhope wrote to say she had always known. Pembridge sent a short note to Eleanor that said only, "Good. It was time." Graves, the solicitor, wrote 3 paragraphs of careful professional warmth and one final sentence. "I confess I had my suspicions from the November dinner." Eleanor read this and laughed, alone at her uncle's desk for the first time in longer than she could account for. The first formal commission under the new arrangement was the northern border water rights. The second was a full review of the estate's land management structure, the largest work Eleanor had undertaken, requiring her to work directly at Grosvenor Square, where the records were too voluminous for Marsh's Bloomsbury house. Edmund's study was large. A second desk was brought in from the adjoining room. Eleanor organized the records across the first week into a system that Edmund, after one attempt to impose an alternative, accepted entirely. They worked well together. This was not a surprise to Eleanor, who had known it would be the case, and was a surprise to Edmund, who had known it intellectually, and found the reality of it different from the anticipation, more comfortable, and for that reason, more unsettling. She arrived at 9. She left at 5. In between, the study had the quality of a room in which 2 people were thinking in the same direction, which was, Edmund had found, a rarer condition than he had previously understood. On the afternoon of the 3rd week, she looked up from the secondary ledgers and said, without preamble, "You were wrong about the 1809 records." "I know," Edmund said. "They need to cross-reference with the Millgate series before the timeline holds." I had gathered. She looked at him. He was at his own desk with the characteristic posture she had catalogued across months. Forward, finger at the margin, full attention on the page. "You are doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "The margin." She indicated the gesture with her own hand. "You trace it when you are thinking. You have done it since November." He looked at his hand and then at her with an expression she had not seen before, caught and not displeased about it. "I was not aware of that." "I have been aware of it," Eleanor said, "since December." A pause. "How much else have you been cataloguing?" "A sufficient amount," she said, and returned to her page. He was quiet. Then, "The habit of leaving documents face up." She stilled. "I noticed I had stopped," Edmund said. "After the 4th report, I set it face down and left it that way for 6 days. He paused. "I understand why now." Eleanor set her pen down. She looked at him across the room, across 3 weeks of organized records, across the months before that, The library, the morning calls, the candle-lit pages she had written and watched him hold with his finger at the margin. "What is your conclusion?" she asked. "On the available evidence." Edmund looked at her steadily. "That I closed it because I was not ready to know what I already knew, and that I was not ready because knowing required me to revise something I had held with a great deal of certainty." He paused. "The survey of 1798 was wrong." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "it was." "I would like," he said, "to submit that conclusion for your review." The silence held. The March light came through the windows properly now, warm and direct, the kind that had decided to be spring. Eleanor looked at the records on her desk, and the pen in her hand, and the room that was not her room and had acquired, across 3 weeks, the quality of a place where she was entirely known. "Your methodology is sound," she said, and there was the ghost of the smile barely there and then fully there. "I find the conclusion compelling." He held her gaze. His own smile arrived and was not withdrawn. "I am glad," he said. "I should like, if you are willing, to extend the inquiry." Eleanor looked at him. "Into what?" Edmund set down the 1809 ledger. He rose from his desk and crossed the room, not quickly, with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and intends to be clear about it, and stopped at the edge of her desk. She looked up at him from her chair, with the level attention she had brought to every conversation they had ever had, and did not look away. "Into whether you would permit me," he said, "to be something other than your employer." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "You will need to be more specific," she said. "I find vague proposals difficult to assess." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am aware of your position on vague proposals." He met her gaze directly. "I am asking whether you would consider allowing me to court you, properly, with the intention of asking you, at the end of it, to marry me." The study was very quiet. Outside, a carriage passed. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. "That is not a vague proposal," Eleanor said. "No." She held his gaze for a long moment. He did not look away, and she noted this. The steadiness of it, the absence of performance, the specific quality of a man who had said a thing and meant it, and was prepared to wait for whatever came next. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not easy to live with." "I know," Edmund said. "You reorganized my entire filing system in 4 days and told me I was wrong about the 1809 ledgers before you had taken your coat off." "And I was right about the 1809 ledgers." "Entirely," he said. "It was one of the more attractive things you have done." Eleanor looked at him. She set her pen down fully, deliberately, the way she set things down when she had finished with them, and was ready to begin something else. She stood. They were close now, the desk no longer between them. The professional distance of the past 3 weeks dissolved by the simple fact of her rising and him not stepping back. "I should also tell you," she said more quietly, "that I'm not certain I know how to be anything other than careful." "Nor am I," Edmund said. "We may have to work it out between us." He paused. "I find I am willing to try if you are." Eleanor looked at him, at the face she had been cataloguing across months, the posture she knew, the finger at the margin habit she had watched from library chairs and morning call settees, and the window seat at Hathersley. She looked at him the way she looked at a set of figures she'd been working through for a long time, and had finally, at the bottom of the last page, found to be correct. "Yes," she said, simply, cleanly, the way she stated conclusions. "I am willing." Edmund reached out and took her hand, her left hand with its faint permanent trace of ink that no amount of washing had ever fully resolved, and held it for a moment. Then he brought it to his lips. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet and deliberate and entirely meant, and Eleanor felt the warmth of it move through her with the slow, certain quality of something she had not let herself anticipate. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had no category for in the ledger she kept, and she decided on reflection that this was acceptable. Some things did not require prior categorization. She lifted her free hand and set it against his jaw lightly, and the careful distance that had governed every conversation they had ever had closed entirely. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was brief and unhurried, and said between them what neither of them had yet said in plain language, which was, "I have been moving toward this for a very long time, and I am not afraid of it any more." When they separated, neither of them spoke immediately. Edmund still held her left hand. The ink stain was, as ever, unresolved. "The 1809 ledgers," Eleanor said after a moment. Edmund looked at her. Are you genuinely returning to the ledgers? I have a system, she said. It does not benefit from interruption. But her mouth curved entirely, for the first time in his presence without being recalled. You may ask your question again in a week. Which question? The one about marriage, Eleanor said. Ask it properly when the Millgate cross-reference is complete and I have not got ink on both hands. Edmund looked at the ink on her left hand, which he was still holding, and at the fresh ink on her right. That seems, he said, a very Eleanor Marsh condition to attach to a proposal. I'm a very Eleanor Marsh sort of person. Yes, he said. You are. He raised her hand again, briefly, before releasing it. 1 week. She sat back down. She picked up her pen. He returned to his desk and picked up the 1809 ledger, and opened it, and set it face up, and found his page. The study was warm. The light was good. Outside, London was ordinary and indifferent, and in a study in Grosvenor Square 2 people were working in the same direction, which was, it turned out, the same thing as moving toward each other, and had been from the beginning without either of them needing to announce it. 1 week later, Edmund asked his question properly. Eleanor's hands were clean. She said yes.